So this is strange, this is odd, this is peculiar. I'm just trying to put the words to what we're dealing with and what we're kind of witnessing today. The coronavirus has affected our community, has affected our families, has affected our church, before it actually ever physically affected our county yet. And so with all of that said, things are different. And yet, as I've had a chance to kind of think about that over the last couple of days, and as I've had a chance to really kind of roll that over in my head and dwell on it, I want to, if you'll let me, I want to give it a new word to kind of describe things. And that word is opportunity. Man, what we have going on right now, I can't help but see as this amazing kind of untapped opportunity that sits in front of us. It's real. Just as we've been talking about it over the last 48 hours, we have this amazing staff and leaders and volunteers who have jumped in to make all of this possible today. And what we have kind of been embracing along the way is this idea of opportunity. For instance, you're sitting in your living room right now. Maybe you're sitting in front of a computer screen. Maybe you're sitting in front of a TV screen. Maybe you've got your family around you, and it's awesome. We have, at last that I saw, over 325, 330 different folks that are logged on right now with people sitting in their living room, and that's awesome. Having said all of that, what about next week? Because next week is an opportunity for you. Next week is an opportunity for you to make an invitation like you have never made before. You have the chance to invite people to come and sit in your living room. You have a chance to invite people to come and come to church with you right next door and have neighbors come. You can have a watch party with all your neighbors. You can have a watch party with friends and family to just come and have church together right there. It's an opportunity to give the link to get on here. And maybe next week somebody takes that link and they watch from their living room. This is unprecedented. This is uncharted territories for it, and it is an opportunity. Now, I don't know how long this is going to go on in this way, but we're anticipating that it's going to be a few weeks at the very least. And so you can start planning right now for the opportunity that awaits you this week and next Sunday. An opportunity to care about and invite people to come to church with you right there in your own living room. Now, it just so happens that it really ties in with what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks, and we'll get to that in just a minute. When my brother was 8 years old, he and my family were going to be taking a trip from Indianapolis to Lexington. Now, this was before I was around, but this story has been relayed to me multiple times by multiple people along the way. My mom, with my dad at work, thought that it would be a good idea for her to go out and fill the car up with gas before they made the trip, and so she headed off to the gas station. It was a gas station that was kind of out on the outskirts of town. It was kind of up on a wooded hillside, and a little picturesque, actually, where she was getting gas at that particular time. And she went inside to pay for the gas, and when she came out, she looked in the car, and my brother was gone. She couldn't find him anywhere, and so she started to kind of calmly but frantically look around the building, maybe look in the back. She noticed the woods were there, and my brother's just 8 years old, but he was already prone to wander, already prone to be that kind of kid that might just go exploring in the woods in a place that he didn't know. She got a little more frantic, and the gas station attendant noticed that she was moving a little more quickly and asked what was going on, found out what was going on, joined in on the search. Other customers joined in on the search. Other people started to show up to get gas and saw that there was a search going on. They jumped in on the search. There were people out in the woods that were already starting to yell his name, Larry, Larry, hoping for some type of response. Nothing was coming. And then when the search party was at its height, my mom had a new wave of reality wash over her. And she found that first gas station attendant, and she tapped him on the shoulder, and she sheepishly said to him, "It's okay, I'm just going to go." Very confused, the guy looked at her and said, "But ma'am, your son," and she said, "It's okay. I never brought him. He was never here. He's home with his sister right now." And she got in the car and she drove off. Now, just to be fair, to my mom, who I believe is watching right now. She is not normally that scatterbrained along the way, but we all know that feeling, right? We all know that panic that comes over us when maybe we've lost someone or lost something that matters to us. Maybe you've lost your kids at the zoo. That happened in our family, and that was panic-stricken for just a little while. Maybe you lost a paycheck that you never got all the way to the bank and you can't figure out what you did with it. Or maybe there's a paper that you spent hours writing and now you can't remember where you saved it on your computer. Or you can't remember exactly where you left your car keys, or where that remote is, or where your retainer is, or just so many different things. Your dog that just you had your eye on them for a second and then they were gone. Whatever the case, we know that feeling of panic. We know that kind of heart-stopping, sweat-producing moment where we realize that we have lost something that matters to us. Well, that just happens to be the feeling that we're going to kind of hang out in for the next few weeks. It's that feeling of searching for the lost. And it's a feeling that gets talked about in some parables that Jesus tells, 3 parables that Jesus tells, 3 stories that show up in Luke chapter 15. And if you've got your Bible with you there at home, we're going to ask that you would open to Luke chapter 15, or you can pull it up on your phone or on your tablet. Or if you've got the FCC app, you can go right to that and you can choose the sermon button, go right down to where it says sermon notes, and you can see all the notes for this morning and any of our sermons, as well as the scriptures that we're following along. And we're kind of right there at the beginning of Luke chapter 15. This whole series is called 15 because we're dealing with these 3 stories that show up throughout Luke 15 over the next 4 weeks. So, Luke chapter 15, stories told by Jesus about this feeling of searching for what's lost. But we kind of need to know why he told the stories. And so we get the why right at the beginning of the chapter as we see this kind of interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees. And here's what we read there. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus because they liked hanging out with Jesus. They really did. And so the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." For a long time, it had bothered the religious people that Jesus seemed to attract the undesirables in the community. And that not only did he attract them, but he seemed to kind of be okay with being around them. And it really bothered the religious folks. It really bothered the people of godliness that Jesus would hang around with those kinds of people. They'd raised the objection before. In fact, they raised the objection back in Luke chapter 5 at a different time. They were upset that Jesus was with tax collectors and sinners. And when they objected that time, Jesus tried to kind of explain himself and why he was doing that and why he was with them. And he said this. He said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So that was Jesus' explanation of himself and why he didn't mind hanging around with people that were undesirable. But that didn't really satisfy all the religious people of the time. They were still bothered that the undesirable folks were even around. They didn't understand why Jesus would even want them there. And so the objection gets raised again. And because the objection gets raised again, Jesus decides to not just explain himself, but explain the lost. Explain why these people are all around him. And just so we understand the scene, it's not that Jesus was hanging out with poor people, or that he was hanging out with homeless people, or that he was hanging out with people who hadn't had a bath in a while, or people who didn't wear the right kinds of clothes, or people that were thirsty. Those may have been issues for some of the folks that were there, but really the reason that the righteous folks, the religious folks, didn't like people like this being around Jesus is because they had lived lifestyles, or they were living lifestyles currently that went directly against the law and the will of God. And because they were directly against the law and the will of God, they should be kind of pushed away. The Pharisees just couldn't fathom any other way to treat people that were going against God's will. And yet here's Jesus who's hanging out with them. Don't get blinded by the rudeness and the legalism of the Pharisees to miss the fact that Jesus was hanging out with people who were living in lifestyles and doing things currently in their life that even some of us in church would cringe to think that Jesus was with people like that. So this time, hearing the objection, Jesus explained the lost. And he didn't just explain it with 2 sentences, he decided to explain it with stories. 3 of them told back to back to back. And for the next 4 weeks, we're going to dive into these stories that Jesus told. And something that I noticed as I was kind of going through Luke chapter 15, I've read these stories all kinds of times before, but I noticed something that I don't remember knowing. Maybe I knew it before, but I'd forgotten along the way. And it's the fact that all 3 of these stories are not actually the same story. Okay, they're not just the exact same thing being told to us from 3 different contexts. It's not just the exact same thing that Jesus is saying from 3 different parts of life to try and drive home one singular point. There's actually something very clever about what Jesus says and how he helps us think about how the lost get lost. So let's jump right in. Verse 4, here's the first story. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Jesus told stories that were really part of culture and part of the life that people were living at the time. Now, that may not necessarily apply to us. There's probably not a lot of us who are here or who are in your living room right now who are shepherds, okay, who understand sheep. Do you know why sheep get lost? Well, Bruce Larson has a great explanation. He puts it this way. He says, they nibble their way into lostness. They move from one tuft of green grass to the next. They keep moving along from tuft to tuft, sometimes right through a hole in the fence. And when they're done nibbling, they can't find the hole. And they're lost. They got there because they wandered aimlessly. They didn't mean to get lost. They didn't mean to wander off. They didn't even know they were wandering at the time. They didn't even know they were lost until they looked up in one moment when they looked around at everything around them and nothing looked familiar anymore. And there are some of us in life that have either been through or are going through that very thing. We've kind of nibbled our way to the station in life that we're in right now. And we look up and we don't see anything that's familiar anymore. And some of us know what that feeling is. Somehow, without malicious intent, without a focus for sure. We kind of ended up aimlessly lost. But when that happens to sheep, shepherds don't then say, well, fend for yourself. Okay, you've kind of made your bed, just go sleep in it. Shepherds don't say, well, that's your fault. You shouldn't have done that, so just kind of whatever happens, happens. No, these space cadet sheep that we're talking about, these are stupid animals who wander off. The shepherd doesn't leave them to fend for themselves. He doesn't leave them alone and out. He makes sure that this shepherd goes looking for them. And he goes looking for them at great risk. Now, the math doesn't actually make sense. The math doesn't make sense to us because here's what the math looks like. The math looks like this fraction. And what happens for the shepherd is that he actually puts at risk the right side of the equation for the sake of the left side of the equation. The potential to lose even more of the 100 is pretty high. I mean, if one sheep could wander off, then certainly more of them could. And they're not going to pay attention because they're just worried about nibbling on that green tuft of grass that's right in front of them. But he doesn't care about the risk. And he doesn't run the analytics. And he doesn't figure out the ratios. And he's not interested in trying to play the odds. He was going after the one that was lost. And the possibility of getting all 100, okay, not just 99 of them, but the possibility of getting all 100 home safely is what's moving him. And to him, when he looks at the whole thing, it is worth the risk. And the emotion that comes over him when it was worth the risk and the wandered aimlessly lost has been found is not just relief that he beat the odds. It is a celebration that the one has been found. Here's what we read in the rest of Jesus' story here. He says, then he calls his friends and his neighbors together, and he says, rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep. And then there's a story that he tells of a lost coin. Now, the coin got lost for an entirely different reason. So go down to verse 8, and here's the story that Jesus tells. He says, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and her neighbors together, and she says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. Chances are this coin that the woman's looking for is a coin that was representative of an entire day's wage. Okay, this is not like the quarter for Aldi that she dropped and lost. Okay, this is something that she worked all day yesterday to have, and it's lost. That whole day is forgotten if she can't find this coin. As I was kind of reading this week, another possibility popped up. William Barclay writes this about that coin. He said, the mark of a married woman was a headdress made of 10 silver coins, linked together by a silver chain. And for years, maybe a girl would scrape and save to amass her 10 coins that would make up this headdress. For the headdress was almost the equivalent to her of her wedding ring. Now, whatever this coin was that this woman lost, it is a coin that mattered to her. But how did it get lost? Because a coin can't nibble its way away into lostness. And a coin can't kind of by itself just wander off. This item got lost because it was handled carelessly. Maybe she wasn't paying attention much when she had that coin in her hand. Or maybe while she was getting ready to put it somewhere, she got distracted and just kind of lost sight of it for a moment and it was gone. Or maybe it's not even her fault. Maybe she handed the coin off to somebody else for them to take care of it and they didn't. Or maybe it's not even known how it got lost. There's just somebody that came along and they accidentally bumped it off a counter and this coin fell to the ground. The point being, sometimes the lost get lost because they get handled carelessly. Sometimes people end up hanging around with the wrong people. And sometimes people end up hanging around in the wrong places. And sometimes people make wrong choices. And sometimes people handle themselves carelessly, but often there are people who tend to handle others carelessly. And when that happens, when you're the one that's been kind of handled carelessly, it makes you feel, well, lost. But the woman went searching. And in her house, and we have to understand her house a little bit, in her house, the dwelling of the time would have had a dirt floor, would have had maybe a thatched rug that was down, and the dwelling probably had one opening in the whole house that would kind of let light in, but it was pretty dimly lit. So she lights a lamp to give it a little more light, but quite honestly, she couldn't just look around the room and find her coin. Instead, she was going to have to get down on her hands and knees and slowly and meticulously sweep through all the dirt in the house, all the dirt floor that was there, all the way through that thatch rug, watching intently for a glint of silver to just pop up. And to do all of that was going to take a while. But to her, it was worth the time. Most things that require meticulousness and patience, well, those are things that today are typically abandoned. If we can get whatever it is that we've lost for not much money, then we'll spend the money rather than spend the time. This woman meticulously, carefully searched through her house until she could find what had been carelessly mishandled. One more story, and it's really the story that we're going to spend the next few weeks on, and we're not going to dive in it too deeply today, but it's a story that the majority of us have probably heard before. It's the story of the lost son. It's a story that we call the story of the prodigal son. It's a story of a boy who goes to his dad and demands that he gets his inheritance early. He wants to get his inheritance now so he can live the way he wants to live, so that he can do the things he wants to do. So that he doesn't have to live under the rule of dad anymore, so he doesn't have to be under the authority of dad anymore, so that he can kind of be the man that he wants to be and do all the things that he wants to do and live all the ways that he wants to live. And he does. And he gets lost. And it's not like the sheep, and it's not like the coin. Because we really don't feel sorry for the lost son throughout most of the story at all. Because he didn't accidentally get lost. He didn't get handled carelessly in this life to a point that he ended up lost. The lost son got lost because he chose intentionally to get lost. Now, this one is a hard one for us to hear. Because I can find it in my heart to have compassion for someone who has just kind of accidentally wandered off. Someone who maybe naively has found themselves lost and away from God. And even the most hardened of us would be willing to have compassion for and to care for and to go looking for someone who has been mistreated in this life, who has been abused in this life. We can certainly have compassion for people like that, but we struggle with those who quite intentionally, quite arrogantly, quite aggressively choose to be lost. Because when it's their choice, and they're the ones that are kind of bringing this on themselves, we kind of make a decision to kind of let them deal with wherever that takes them. And let them just kind of have the life that they have chosen to have. But what Jesus shares in this story, and that we're going to unpack over the next few weeks, and it's going to be a little bit tough at times, is that even the arrogant and intentionally lost, they are worth the wait. Now, you may have heard all these stories before, or you've read all these stories before, but I'm just asking us to take a really fresh look at these stories from Jesus so we make sure that we understand what Jesus is trying to teach us. Because what Jesus was explaining was something that the Pharisees and the religious folks in the crowd had never considered about God. Because they could kind of get on board with a God who, if somebody came crawling back to him, okay, if somebody was at the lowest point of life and they would truly humble themselves and come back and throw themselves on the mercy of the throne of God, that God would at that point perhaps have pity on them. The Pharisees could get on board with that form of God. And maybe that's all that you can kind of think of God as well. But you see, what Jesus was explaining was something that the Pharisees, that the religious leaders could not comprehend. A God who was willing to get down off his throne. A God who was willing to go out and go searching. A God who was going to go and pursue the lost no matter how they got lost. That form of God was unfathomable for the Pharisees. And I think that to some degree, that form of God is unfathomable to some of us in the church when we think about some of the people that we know. And I also think that even to people who feel lost right now, it might be unfathomable to them that there would be a God who loves them and who cares for them and who would pursue them and chase after them and search for the lost. And what God is sharing with us through these words and these stories of Jesus is that it is worth the risk. And it is worth the time. And it is worth the wait. But see, the wanderers, they look up and they realize that they're lost, but it doesn't seem as though anyone is looking for them. And the mishandled feel like the whole world is rushing by them, but nobody seems to notice them. And there are people in this life who are lost, who got there intentionally, that don't think that it matters if anybody cares about them, but one day it will. And there are people who are in your life right now who are lost for some of or all of those reasons. And how they got lost, it matters. But it doesn't change their value to God. And it shouldn't change their value to you. Whether it was for a sheep reason, or it was for a coin reason, or it was for a son reason, the lost are being searched for and pursued by our God. Now, as a reminder of all three of these stories, we had a coin created on a keychain. It's a coin that has the church logo on one side, and on the back side has that fraction that we looked at earlier, 1/100th. This is a reminder to you of these stories that Jesus told, of people who get lost because they wander, and people who get lost because they get mishandled, and people who get lost because they choose to get lost. But a reminder of how much they are worth the risk and worth the time and worth the wait. Now, with all that has taken place this week, we haven't completely figured out exactly how we're going to be distributing these to you, but we have these available. And even if it's near the end of this series that we make them available, we want you to put these on your keychain. We want you to put these on your backpack. And we want you to keep them nearby just to remind you that the lost matter to God. And they should matter to us. And whether you have the reminder in your hand right now or not, the reminder can start this week. You can start thinking right now, who needs to be sitting in your living room with you next Sunday? Who needs to be invited over? Maybe it's some family friends through the kids. Maybe it's some of the kids that your kids know. Maybe it's some students who need to come over. Maybe it's some neighbors who need to come over, some friends, some family members that need to be invited in. Maybe it's someone that you need to share with them the FCC Live link so that they can watch next Sunday. This is a different time. This is a strange time. It's a peculiar time. It is a unique time. We can put all kinds of words to it, but this is a time of opportunity to reach and to search and to pursue those who right now find themselves lost.